Thanks for coming. I think we're going to have a great event today. Thanks also to my colleague, Professor Rebecca Kobrin, for being, again, a conspirator. This is being co-sponsored by the Center of Israeli and Jewish Studies at Columbia also. And it's a pleasure to have here to my left, though it's not an indication of his political position, Professor Raanan Rein from the University of Tel Aviv. He's a historian there. He's also the vice president of the University of Tel Aviv. And I think people think that he's going to be the future prime minister, but he's waiting for Bibi to retire because it's too tough a competition. Who knows where we'll get. Raanan is, I have known him for a long time. Raanan, as a historian, began actually interested in Spain, and he's a historian of Spain. His first works were on Franco and political diplomacy between Spain and Israel later. Then he became also a historian of Latin America. After he married an Argentine, he has become an expert on Argentinian history, has written several books on Peronism and football in Argentina. Most recently, he has become also a scholar of the Jewish diasporic experience in Latin America, has written several books about that. And today so therefore he's the perfect person to talk about something. I counted it, the third time that he has come to the Forum of Migration. Once was about, the talk was about Argentines in Israel, Argentine Jews in Israel. The second one was about football and a Jewish team in Buenos Aires, and he compared it to a Palestinian team, football team in Santiago de Chile. And now today is going to be talking about the Latin American presence in Israel, but not only about Latin American Jews that have been in Israel for 60, 70 years, but for also about a new movement of the last 2-3 decades of non-Jewish Latin Americans in Israel. So it's very interesting, all of these questions about religion, identity, belonging. So I'm very happy and I'm very thankful that he always agrees to come. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Jose. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to be here again. Shalom, buenas tardes. I would like to start by thanking both the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, especially Professor Rebecca Kobrin, for her initiative to invite me to talk in her seminar. I'll be talking tomorrow about soccer, ethnicity, and identity. And thank you so much, Jose, for this invitation. Indeed, we have been very good friends for, 30 years or something. Yeah. We first met in Buenos Aires, I think probably in the late 1980s, so maybe more than 30 years ago. Who knows? At any rate, thank you all for coming today. And the title of my talk is Jewish and non-Jewish Latinos in Israel, Religion, Culture, and Identity. And let me start, obviously, with a soccer story. It was already overtime, 91st minute, if we want to be precise. Cáceres, a player of the Uruguayan national team, committed a handball in the penalty box, resulting in a penalty kick. And who was the one to kick the penalty? The greatest player nowadays, Leo Messi of the Argentine national team. There was a moment of silence in the new Bloomfield Stadium of Tel Aviv as 30,000 spectators were watching the moves of the best player in the world. Messi indeed scored a goal, and people started chanting his name in frenzy. The so-called Fiesta Rioplatense, which started a few days earlier, reached its climax. Most spectators in this game, which took place only a few weeks ago and ended in a tie, were Israelis of Latin American origins, or if you prefer, Latin American Israelis. They obviously wanted to see soccer idols such as Leo Messi, Luis Suarez, Edinson Cavani, or Sergio Aguero. But at the same time, they wanted to make a statement, show their presence and importance in Israeli society, and highlight their hyphenated identity as Latin American Israelis. All the tickets to the Argentina-Uruguay match sold in a lightning speed in less than 2 hours, leaving many thousands of soccer fans, especially Latin American Israelis, deeply disappointed. People arrived at the stadium a long time before the beginning of the game, carrying Argentine and Uruguayan flags and making sure that sounds, smells, and colors of their home countries were present, with their faces painted in blue and white, the unavoidable bombos, chorizo stands, and mate. For some of the 30,000 spectators who bought tickets in time, the game was a dream coming true. And I quote, "As soon as we heard about this game, our entire family ran to buy tickets," recalled 30-year-old Gustavo Alguea, who moved from Santa Fe, Argentina, Messi's hometown, to Tel Aviv as a child. "What can be better than to see Messi play in the Holy Land," he said, "and especially against Uruguay. After all, this is the Clásico," he added, referring to the traditional rivalry between these two South American countries. Jonathan Mittelman, who had moved from Montevideo to Israel about a decade ago, hoped that his native country would win, but agreed that Messi's team had better chances, and the same goes for his 6-year-old son. There are currently about 70,000 Israeli citizens of Latin American origins. Together with their children born in Israel, they probably number over 150,000. The majority of them are Argentines, and this includes the Consul General of Israel, present here, as well as my wife and my 2 kids. These numbers do not include the several thousands of undocumented workers from Latin America in Israel. Most of them nowadays are from Mexico and the Andean countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Interestingly enough, the latter group of migrant workers has received no less scholarly attention than the Jewish Latin Americans who have made aliyah, that is relocated from Latin America to Israel. So my talk today is divided to 2 parts. The first one dedicated to the majority of Latin Americans who have relocated to Israel in the framework of the law of return, that is the Jewish Latin Americans who moved to Israel. And the second part will be devoted to Latin American migrant workers whose number was dramatically reduced at the beginning of this century, but there are still thousands of them in the country. First, let me clarify a few things as to Jewish immigration to Israel. Some of you are surely aware of this. Over the years, the State of Israel has made considerable efforts to actively recruit Jewish immigrants, granting them full citizenship immediately upon arriving, and Israel relies exclusively on the system of jus sanguinis, law of blood, to determine the citizenship status of immigrants and their descendants. Israel's claim to be the homeland of the Jewish diaspora characterizes its Jewish newcomers as returning ethnic immigrants. Jewish immigrants in Israel are labeled olim, from the Hebrew word aliyah, literally ascent. The centrality of the idea of immigration as a return from the diaspora is reflected in Israel's law of return, adopted in 1950, and the law of nationality of 1952. These laws create a legal framework that grants to Jews and their children, even their grandchildren, even if they themselves are not Jewish, the right to settle in Israel and the right to Israeli citizenship upon arrival. As a self-defined Jewish state, Israel is committed to the successful integration of its Jewish immigrants. They not only have privileged access to citizenship and societal goods, but they also benefit from state financial and institutional support to ease their transition from their country of origin and to facilitate their integration into Israeli society. The number of Latin American immigrants arriving in Israel during the first decade of its existence, that is, let's say, between 1948 and 1960, was very small, a total of about 6,000 immigrants. But the number increased during the 1960s and the 1970s, reaching about 20,000 each decade. Traditional historiography claims that during these years, Jewish Latin Americans were motivated to migrate first and foremost by ideological, that is, Zionist motivations or reasons. Recent studies, however, by scholars like Sebastian Klo or Adrian Krupnik, who is here with us, have questioned these assumptions, and what they show is that most Latin American or Jewish Latin Americans who have relocated to Israel have done so because of economic or political motivations, and these are related to the recurrent economic and political crisis in Latin America or the military dictatorships of the 1960s and 1970s in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Chile, and in Brazil. Most of the Latin American immigrants arrived, as I said, from Argentina, but that migration declined during the 1980s and the 1970s as democracy was reinstated in this country. During the early 2000s, a major economic crisis led to a massive exodus of Argentines to many countries around the world. About 6,000 of them arrived in Israel in the year 2002, fleeing financial and economic upheavals. But already in 2003, the number of arrivals has gone down again, and we are talking now about only a few hundreds each year. In a sharp contrast to other communitarian groups that have acquired a distinctive ethnic identity in Israel because they arrived in one or several massive waves, the Latin American immigrants or the Latin American immigration was cumulative rather than an abrupt process. So immigrants from Latin America came in relatively small groups. But if we talk about other waves of immigration, so for example, immigration from the Arab world who came after 1948, or the massive waves of immigration from the former Soviet Union during the 1990s, had a dramatic impact on Israeli society. So in this sense, Latin American immigrants were compared to North American immigrants who also came in relatively small numbers and in a cumulative way, and most of them were related to the hegemonic group in Israel, that is Ashkenazi Jews. So the immigration of Jewish Latin Americans to Israel did not have such an impact on the Israeli mindset, like in the case of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, or the case of a smaller wave of immigration, but still a dramatic one from Ethiopia. Both of these groups, those from the former Soviet Union and those from Ethiopia, had a strong impact on Israeli society, and they required a large investment of resources in order to assist in their integration into Israeli society. In addition, and in contrast to other migrant groups, Latin Americans have not displayed patterns of residential concentration and are dispersed into mixed communities all over the country, in different cities, in moshavim and kibbutzim. The demographic distribution of the Latin Americans throughout Israel is such that on the one hand, their presence is felt everywhere, but on the other hand, their geographical distribution has made it difficult for them to assert themselves collectively. Another factor hampering the emergence of a collective ethnic assertiveness is the huge diversity of Latin American Israelis. Whereas a pan-Latin American identity has been constructed in Israel, based mainly on language and cultural manifestations, there are still very many sources of division and discord between Argentine immigrants, who constitute the majority, and immigrants from countries such as Peru, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela. Even Argentines are divided between those originally coming from the city of Buenos Aires, the so-called porteños, and immigrants from the provinces of the interior. Still, as I said, over the years, they have created a wide variety of social, religious, economic, and professional institutions that provide Latin American migrants with help and support. Another point which I would like to highlight is that economically speaking, Latin American immigrants enjoy a relatively advantageous position in the Israeli labor market. A recent study by Rebecca Reichman shows that they are located in the middle of the ethnic hierarchy and have attained social and economic occupational positions of a similar status to that of Israeli native-born, higher than that of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopia, or from Asia and North Africa, but relatively lower than that of immigrants from Western Europe or the United States. As to gender gaps, Latino women, like all other working women, seem to suffer from structural disadvantages in the Israeli labor market, deriving from their concentration in female-dominated occupations, especially in the social services sector. A further factor that facilitated the integration of Argentine to society had to do with their comparatively better knowledge of Israel and of the Hebrew language prior to their immigration, and this is particularly true for immigrants who came in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, but not that much anymore. In social terms, the Latin Americans' passion and cultural orientation are assets in the informal, improvisational climate of Israeli society. As one of my interviewees told me, it is cool to be Latino in Israel. Bars with Latin names, such as Evita in Tel Aviv or Che Guevara in Rishon LeZion, were popular with young people, and not to mention restaurants like El Gaucho, Bariloche, Don Alberto, and others that you can probably see here now on the screen. In addition, interest in Spanish-speaking cultures has grown dramatically in recent decades as a result of increased numbers of young Israeli backpackers, mochileros, traveling to South America, usually after completing their obligatory military service. The rise in popularity of Spanish-language soap operas or telenovelas and Latin American music among the Israeli public have also contributed to the interest in Latin American cultures. Already in 1977, for example, several of Israel's leading singers joined together to produce a radio show, later made into a best-selling album of Brazilian songs translated into Hebrew. The program and the album, entitled Eretz Tropit Yafa, a beautiful tropical land, marked the beginning of a kind of a Latin American music craze in Israel. A decade later, the Latin sound of a band called Atraf, and led by Peruvian-born musicians Victor Asus and Ruben Salomon, became very popular in Israel. The members of this group emphasized that the Latin identity was central to their musical performances. They translated into Hebrew popular songs like La Bamba or Guantanamera. But for me, the most interesting album, released in 1995, was the one titled Latini, Ivri, Latini. That is Latino, Hebrew, Hebrew, Latino. Is there a better indication of the emergence of a Latino-Israeli identity? I also put on the screen a few lines from a song written by Shlomo Yidov, also an Israeli of Argentine origins. His album, Ahava Rishona, Primer Amor, includes his very famous song, which says, and I'll read it in Hebrew first, and then in a translation to English, אני חושב ואני כותב בעברית בלי קושי, ואוהב לאהוב אותך בעברית בלעדית. זאת שפה נהדרת, לא תהיה לי אחרת, אך בלילה אני חולם עוד בספרדית. And the translation appears here on the screen. I think and I write in Hebrew without any difficulty, and love to love you exclusively in Hebrew. It's a great language. I wouldn't have it any other way. But at night, I still dream in Hebrew. In Spanish, sorry. As for telenovelas, it is worth mentioning that we had two TV channels in Israel, Viva and Viva Platina, devoted exclusively to telenovelas, and that telenovelas are broadcasted regularly on several other channels as well. These series are subtitled, so the Israeli audience gets accustomed to listening to Spanish. Although the first Latin American telenovela to be broadcasted in Israel was the Mexican one, Los Ricos También Lloran, The Rich Also Cry. It was broadcasted about 2 decades ago. The telenovelas channels have been devoted mostly or were dominated by Argentine rather than Mexican or Colombian programs. Interestingly enough, one of the main producers of Argentine telenovelas in recent years was an Argentine Israeli, Yair Dori, wounded in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Together with the Argentine Cris Morena, the two of them produced the hugely successful telenovelas, Chiquititas, Rincón de Luz, and Rebelde Way. By now, it should be clear that Latin American immigrants have placed great weight on their cultural and social integration into Israeli society, and they have succeeded in attaining a degree of insertion that is in striking contrast to their place or to the place they occupy here in the US. Many have attained prominent positions in liberal professions, academia, industry, or agriculture, and therefore they project an image of a successful integration, especially as individuals. Yet, collectively speaking, again, as I said earlier, until fairly recently, they were considered as an invisible community. They preferred individual mobility to communal assertiveness. Why have Latin Americans refrained from assuming a communal public visibility for so many years? My argument is that precisely because of their success, they felt less of a need to create, let's say, a political party like the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. And yet, in recent years, due to the new climate of identity politics in Israel, Latin American Israelis have also begun to assert their communal cultural identity in a large number of events, conferences, and the like. In the past decade, there has been a stream of autobiographies, biographies, and books documenting the contribution of Jewish Latin Americans to Israeli society, to the kibbutzim movements, etc. Another measure intended to raise the public profile of Latin American Israelis was the ceremony organized in 2006 by the organization called OLE. This is the organization of immigrants from Latin America, Spain, and Portugal, and they had about 25 branches around the country. In this ceremony, they gave 2 immigrants of Argentine background an honorary membership in the association, and the 2 were the brain surgeon, Dr. Jose Cohen, a leading member of the team that operated on former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon at the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, and singer Pablo Rosenberg, who, born in Rosario, Argentina in 1965, had arrived in Israel with his parents at the age of 10, and he's now also a TV idol. He has a program as a supposedly mochilero, going to different places around the world. On the screen, I have put also the photos of just a few famous Latin American Israelis. I should have included your photo as well, Danny. My apology. And they include Manuel Trachtenberg, a professor of economics of Tel Aviv University, a former Knesset member or parliament member of the Labour Party, and also Gideon Saar, as you can see in an article published in Spain in the daily newspaper El País. Gideon Saar, el hijo del médico argentino que osa retar a Benjamin Netanyahu. He was the Likud member who was challenging Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership in the Likud party. And yet, in recent years, so I talked about this. Finally, I would like to say a word about the internet, which provides the space where Latin American identity is asserted most noticeably. In recent years, there has been an exponential increase in the number of Latin American sites accessed by many non-Latinos. These sites serve simultaneously as an instrument of cohesion among Latinos in Israel, but also as a means for their integration into Israeli society. Unsurprisingly, there has also been a growing trend of Israeli students taking Spanish courses, both in Israeli high schools and Israeli universities. And concerning the influence of telenovelas on learning Spanish, scholars Rosalie Sitman and Yvonne Lerner have correctly argued that whether we like these series or not, they cannot be ignored, because Spanish teachers have reported that many students do not start their Spanish studies as complete beginners, but have some previous knowledge of the language, particularly as far as comprehension and speaking. The law of return allows not only Jews, but also partners of Jews to become Israeli citizens. This allows at times for unfortunate cases of Jewish or non-Jewish criminals to take advantage of this law. Let me mention here just one very recent unfortunate case. This is the case of Teodoro Anibal Gauto, wanted for crimes in Argentina's dirty war that Israel would not extradite. Gauto fled to Israel in 2003, and since then lives in Israel under the name Yosef Carmel. Gauto had served as a civilian in Argentina's military intelligence battalion 601, which was notorious for its involvement in abductions and murders. In 2011, an Interpol red notice was issued for Gauto's alleged role in the crimes of the military junta. In 2015, Gauto was exposed by the Argentine-Israeli journalist Shlomo Slutsky, but Israel has so far refused to extradite him. As an editorial in the daily newspaper Haaretz made clear, the position of Israeli authorities conveys the distorted message that the law of return grants immunity to criminals. At any rate, music, along with language and sports, has always been a major element of collective identity among Latin Americans in Israel, legal and illegal, Jews and non-Jews alike. So now, let me talk briefly about non-Jewish Latinos in Israel. There are these non-Jewish Latinos are mostly undocumented migrant workers. Until the beginning of the 1990s, Israel had only a few migrant workers, but it did rely heavily on Palestinian labor from the occupied territories for construction, agriculture, and services. A combination of security measures and a deliberate separation policy have led to a shortage of Palestinian workers. The temporary solution advocated by the government was to invite migrant workers from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. A booming economy brought large numbers of tourists and pilgrims from Latin America and Africa as well, and they also blended into the labor market. At its peak in the year 2000, the number of legally and illegally employed migrant workers in Israel exceeded 250,000, excluding Palestinians. That is about 1/10 of the local labor force. As the second intifada erupted, the economy took a dive, unemployment soared, and foreign workers were blamed. The fact that most foreigners took Palestinians rather than Israeli jobs and worked in positions that Israelis were not willing to fill did not matter much. An aggressive media campaign, incitement by Israeli politicians at the national and municipal levels, and an effective deportation police force reduced the number of migrant workers dramatically. At the moment, the number of undocumented workers in Israel is estimated at about 75,000, most of them from Eastern Europe and Latin America. Reports in the press talk about 2,000 from Mexico, 1,300 from Venezuela, and smaller numbers from various Central and South American countries. One of the Israeli TV channels broadcasted the story of Emerson, this is not his real name, who left Peru a couple of years ago and entered Israel with a 3-month tourist visa. While in Israel, Emerson, a former army computer technician who is in his mid-30s, became impressed by Israeli culture, Israeli society, and economy, and decided to stay. He now works in various jobs as painter, cleaner, builder, and electrician. Quoting from his testimony to I-24 News, he says, "Israel is much better than at home. It's safer. Also, the economy is better. For someone that likes to work, it's not hard to make a living here. When I got here, I was impressed. I really liked it. The order, the fact that there is a government that enforces the law, you feel happy and safe. I was also impressed by the culture, and I liked it and chose to stay. If there was a possibility for me to stay and live here forever, I would definitely do it." Diana, a native of the Colombian city of Cali, complained of the lack of health insurance, and I quote, "I came with my husband and my 2 kids, and we knew we were going to stay for some time. But when the kids settle, learn the language, and go to school, you end up wanting to stay longer. The kids have health insurance, the 2 of us don't. It's hard for us. We don't have sick days, no social security, nothing," end of quote. Asked why they chose Israel of all countries, Diana revealed that her parents are also in Israel working. Looking into how to make his move legal and permanent, Emerson hit the iron wall of Israel's immigration policy. Citizenship is almost never granted to non-Jews unless they get hitched to a local. And here he points to an interesting phenomenon that most Israelis are unaware of. And let me quote from his testimony. "My friends tell me that the best way is to find a wife," Emerson recalls. "I've searched, but they want to charge me. One Latin American woman with Israeli citizenship wanted to charge me 80,000 shekels and another 50,000 shekels. I tried to negotiate or even tried to do it with monthly installments, but they refused. It was cash and one payment, end of quote. The testimonies of Emerson and Diana seem to be similar to the testimonies collected by Barak Kalir in his 2010 book, Latino Migrants in the Jewish State. Kalir studied the 1990s migrant workers, many of whom were deported in the early 2000s. He estimated that in the year 2000, there were 5,000 migrant workers from Ecuador and Israel, more than 4,000 from Colombia, 1,200 from Chile, 1,200 from Peru, 500 from Bolivia, and smaller numbers from other countries. Kalir's book is important because he makes a clear distinction between state policies and the attitudes of civil society and the media. He was interested mostly in the lived experiences of Latinos as they found accommodation and jobs, made friends, developed a rich recreational scene, formed families, and developed a deep sense of belonging to Israeli society. In the introduction of his book, he quotes Antonio, an Ecuadorian worker, who stated, and I quote again, "It is amazing, but there is no racism in Israel. Nobody treats you badly because of who you are." End of quote. This affirmation as to the lack of racism in Israel will be contested by many, let's say, Arab Israelis or African migrant workers, but indeed, undocumented Latinos suffer less of discrimination in Israel compared to many European countries, and most of them have adopted well to their new lives. Although illegal, the chances of Emerson and Diana of being deported are slim. The presence of Latin American migrant workers largely goes unnoticed, in contrast to the tens of thousands of African migrants, mostly from Sudan and Eritrea, who had crossed the border from Egypt and found themselves in the center of a heated political debate. For the Latin Americans, skin color is priceless for flying under the radar. An activist in the NGO called the Hotline for Migrants and Refugees explained, "The Latin Americans managed to survive because they look like us," end of quote. Since I started this talk with a soccer story, let me end it with another soccer story. Most Argentine soccer clubs have branches or organized groups of fans in Israel. Here on the screen, you can see the fans of River Plate praying at the Wailing Wall for their team's victory. But in many ways, the most important branch of Argentine soccer fans in Israel has been of the fans of the Club Atlético Atlanta of the supposedly Jewish neighborhood of Villa Crespo. Atlanta has been or had settled in Villa Crespo in 1922, and since then became a kind of a symbol of Jewish integration into Argentine society. And both affiliated and non-affiliated Jews have become fans or fanatics of Atlanta. No wonder that when Atlanta went on its first tour outside of the America, it chose the state of Israel. It was in 1963 when they played against Maccabi Tel Aviv and won, and played against the Israeli national team and lost. At any way, this is a fascinating topic. I'll talk about it tomorrow in Rebecca Cobrin's seminar. So let me end here and open the floor to comments, questions and discussion. Jose, you lead it. Thank you very much.
So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments, questions, and discussion. Right there,
Thank you, Raanan. Very interesting and informative presentation.
I think that he's an Atlanta fan. So.
I'm not. No, I'm Boca Juniors.
Okay. Nobody's perfect.
Okay. So my comment has to do with labels and categories of analysis. In the title of your talk and also in your presentation, you use Latinos and Latin Americans. And we know that these categories, these labels, change over time and so on. And this country perhaps is an incredible laboratory in making new labels. So I want to know what's the situation with these labels in Israel now. If Latin Americans now perceive themselves as Latinos, because unless I'm wrong, when I go to Latin America, when I go to Argentina, nobody understands when I refer to Latinos. Okay? People understand that the Latino label is basically a North American product. Okay? Even in Europe, it seems that this is the same situation. My impression is things are changing a little bit, and I wonder where we are in the case of Israel.
I was going to say actually that when you mentioned Europe, in Spain, they never used the term Latino. Now is the normal accepted term for people of Latin American origins. They used to use either Latin Americans or, when they wanted to be nasty, Sudacas, which was a respective term for Argentines. But now Latino is the...
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. What you see is a gap between the language used by scholars when discussing the experiences of Latin Americans in Israel and the language used by Latin Americans themselves. So we scholars normally use the term Latin Americans or Latin American Israelis, or when we refer to Jewish Latin Americans versus non-Jewish Latin Americans in Israel. But if you look at the internet sites of Latin Americans in Israel, they often use the term or the concept of Latinos. So yes, in this talk I've used both terms, in part because I don't want to impose too much my own categories and language on the subjects that I study. So yes, it's Latinos and it's Latin Americans, whatever one prefers. Yeah.
Is there a difference in the use of the term Latinos, whether they're Latin American Jews or non-Jews, or doesn't?
No difference at all.
Thank you very much. I'll give you a two-part question. You touched on the issue of the ideological migration and then the economic and the conflict with the economic one. So if you compare the Latin American immigration in Israel to other immigrations, non-Latin American ones, and the percentage that then stays, right, that doesn't re-immigrate out, can you talk about that? I have an idea, but I want to make sure I hear from you. And then that can be the way you differentiate between the ideological and the economic one, right? In the economic one, people leave. When the things get better where they came from, they go back, et cetera, et cetera. If you can touch on that, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so the dominant narrative always emphasizes the ideological or Zionist motivation for relocation from the diaspora to Israel. But all too often when you start digging in, you see that most people are looking for better opportunities, for better education for the kids, for better economic positions, etc. And they leave their home country when there's an economic depression or an economic crisis, etc. Although you can never fully divide the motivation of an individual to relocate from one place to another. It's always a combination of different motivations. But there was a tendency to say Jewish Latin Americans who moved to Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they all did it because of ideology. But more recent immigrants are motivated by economic reasons. As to return migration of Jewish Argentines or Jewish Americans or Jews from other countries, there has been very little research on this topic because we Israelis prefer to highlight the supposed success of those who relocated to Israel and stayed there, and to ignore or avoid the stories of supposed failure of those who relocated to Israel and decided at one point to go back to their country of origin, to their home country. In the dominant narrative, when you talk about return migration, you talk about Jews returning from the diaspora to their ancient homeland in Israel. So we do have an expert on Jewish Argentine return migration here. This is Raanan Rein, who has just submitted his doctoral dissertation on this topic. When we first embarked on this journey, we were amazed by the fact that there is no study about Jewish Americans who relocated to Israel and decided to go back to the US. An individual decides to go back because of very many reasons. And it doesn't matter whether he or she took the initial step of relocating to Israel because of economic, political, ideological reasons. There are many reasons to go back, but we have no data, no statistic as to the percentage of Jewish Latin Americans who went back to their home countries. In the case of Argentina, we're talking about thousands and thousands of people. And for many of them, the Israeli chapter in their biography is very meaningful, and this has reshaped the ties between Jewish Argentines and Israel to a large extent. So we already have one pioneering study, but there's still much to do about this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Basically, you already responded to my question about the Yerida between among Latin American Jews. You said that there are no hard data, so it's impossible to compare Yerida of Latin American Jews with other groups from, let's say, Western Europe or ex-Soviet Union. My question is a bit different. It's about language nuance. For example, in Israel, all people who come from Soviet Union, they're Russians, no matter if they're Jews, Muslim, or Christians. Israeli basically don't make any difference. They don't distinguish between Jews, Christian, and Muslim. All of them are Russians. And the same thing, for example, Anglim, who come from basically all Anglo-Saxon world. Now, about Latin America, Sfaradim, that's basically, I'm trying to grapple with this term, because Sfaradim, as opposed to Ashkenazim, it's Jews from Sfarad, and who lives mostly in the Middle East, Turkey, Balkans. Now, Sfaradim in Israel who come from South America, they're also Sfaradim because they speak Spanish. Sfarad, it's Spain in Hebrew. And also non-Jews who come from South America, they're also Sfaradim. So Sfaradim basically means now three different things in Israel. Can you comment on my topic?
Yeah. No, your question reminds me of an anecdote when my son started high school. He was asked by a classmate whether he was Sephardic or Ashkenazi. And he wasn't able to answer the question. He said, my mother speaks Spanish, so maybe we are Sephardic. But at the same time, no, my grandfather came to Argentina from Poland, so we are probably not Sephardic. He was confused, so it is a bit confusing. Curiously enough, my impression is that Sephardic Jews who come from Argentina are not considered Sephardic by Israeli society, but as Latin Americans. So if you relocate from Argentina to Israel, you are Latin American, no matter whether you are of Sephardic origin or Ashkenazic origin. In Argentina itself, for many years, you had these divisions between the so-called Rusos and the so-called Turcos, supposedly Ashkenazi Jews and Jews who came from the Ottoman Empire, that is from the Middle East and the Balkans. But somehow the Sephardic identity of Jews from Argentina is diluted, and they become part of the general Latin American category, at least in Israel.
But my impression was the other way around, that most Latin American Jews fall under this category of Western Jews. They're not Mizrahim, they're not from the Arab countries, they're not Russians. So they seem to fall in that category of
category of
Canadians
their
and,
own. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there was some
Yeah, there
question.
were some questions.
I have two related questions. You mentioned re-immigration, but in the context of people who move back to their home country. I know in the case of Russians, for example, a lot of them, if they wound up leaving Israel, they didn't go back to Russia. A lot of them went to the US or Canada. And part of it, which brings up my second question, is failure to integrate, not just for economic reasons, but a lot of the Soviet Jews, for example, were highly educated and very secular, and they just couldn't stand a essentially religious-oriented society. I mean, you could ask the question, what did they think they were getting into? What did they understand Israel would be? Same thing, you know, how did the Hispanic Jews and non-Jewish Hispanics, what did they expect, and how strong was their own identity as, you know, outside of just being Jewish, but being Hispanic, or, you know what I'm saying, right?
Mm-hmm. One has to make a difference between the times of the former Soviet Union and more recent years. It's true that for Jews who left the Soviet Union, going back to their home was not a possibility. So if they relocated to Israel, either they stayed in Israel or they moved to a third country. But in recent years, you do have return migration of, let's say, Jewish Russians to Russia. Much depends on the economic circumstances, on the possibility to make a living there, etc. What's the percentage of Jewish Russians who immigrated to Israel and left the country? Again, I have no data. It's surely a minority, but still a substantial number. On the whole, I consider this immigration from the former Soviet Union as a huge success. It's true that many of them had suffered from all sorts of negative stereotypes for different reasons, but on the whole, I think that they did manage to integrate themselves and to attain important positions in all spheres of activity.
But do people really study? What do immigrants think of the country that they're about to immigrate to? Like Iraqi refugees, what do they think of Germany before they go? Like, what do they know about Germany? When they move to the U.S., what do they expect to get out of it? You know, same question. You know, when people come here from other countries, even our own ancestors, right? My ancestors came here after the Holocaust. What did they expect? What did they know about America? And to the extent they may have been disappointed, there are ways of reacting to, different people reacted to it in different ways. Some went to Israel, some tried to change the culture that they wound up in, some just, went crazy. You see all this in Jewish history in different places.
Yeah.
I mean, do people really study this in your experience?
There are many studies of attitudes and opinions of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, definitely, because we are talking about a very large group.
The immigrants themselves, not the Israeli societies of Russians. When the Russians moved to Israel, before they moved to Israel, what did they expect? Before Iraqis moved to Germany, what did they expect of Germany? Not what did Germany think of the Iraqis, what did the Iraqis think? When the Jews moved to the U.S. after the Holocaust, what did they think America would be like? And what were their plans for thinking, well, what happens if it's not what I think it is?
Okay, I understand your question, and I say that there's a growing number of studies as to attitudes and opinions among immigrants from the former Soviet Union, especially since we are talking about a very large group. So mostly sociologists have been working on this. And you see different opinions, different attitudes. Again, looking at internet sites is very illustrative, let's say. There's a relatively new website called what's that? Of female immigrants from the former Soviet Union talking about their experiences during the first few years in Israel. And it's a hugely popular site, mentioned in all daily newspapers and TV channels, etc. In most cases, I guess that I read something like 200 testimonies out of, I don't know, 1,000. They mostly complained about the way they were treated during the first few years, but they do celebrate the success of their integration into Israeli society. Yes, there were all sorts of negative stereotypes about Russian women being prostitutes, easy to get, etc., etc. But at least in this specific website, the vast majority is happy about the decision to relocate to Israel. I think that the name of the site is Russiyot lelo chush humor. Yeah, Russian women without a sense of humor. But it's extremely popular, I mean, among Israelis of all walks of life.
I have a question about the political ideology of the Latin Americans. Do they tend to be all over the place, or do they tend to themselves to align with either the left or the right or the center? Or?
Unlike the case of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, who in their majority tend to support right-of-center political parties, in the case of Jewish Latin Americans in Israel, you can see them in each and every political party, from Kahana supporters in the extreme right wing and to the Likud party, this new political party, Blue and White, Kahol Lavan, in the left of center, Meretz, or nowadays it's both Meretz and the Labour Party, so you can see them in the Labour Party as well, and you can see some of them in the Israeli Communist Party, Hadash, as well. So, no. It's true that in the 1960s there was a fairly large number who went to the kibbutzim movement, and over there, yeah, many of them were, let's say, left of center or somehow identify themselves with the Labour Party in its different stages. Yeah, do you want to say something about it? One second, could you give them?
My family, myself and my cousins, all of us born in Argentina, you have the entire representation of the political spectrum in Israel.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah. in a way, it reinforces what I said earlier. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a great talk. I wonder if you could just reflect on the legal frameworks in which non-Jewish Latinos arrive in Israel. That's part one.
Okay.
Meaning work visas, student visas, do they just tourist visas? And two, if you could reflect on their social class, because they're not walking over the border, they're flying. It's an expensive flight, and just thinking about how that figures into who this group is.
Yeah, these are great questions. Most of them enter the country as pilgrims to the Holy Land. So they get a 3-month visa as tourists. And then some of them decide to stay, or they come initially with the idea of staying. I would say that many of them belong to the lower middle class. In some cases, they use their own savings in order to travel to Israel. But in Barak Khalil's book, you could see cases of villages or neighborhoods where people collected money from various individuals in order to help them fly to Israel, and then later on they used to send money back to the village or the neighborhood. But yes, you don't see very many from the lower or lowest echelon of society. They are mostly lower middle class or even middle class, like the case of this Emerson, the Peruvian guy who was a computer technician in the Peruvian army. So he wasn't rich. He's willing to work now as a cleaner or painter or whatever. But yeah, it's middle to lower middle class mostly.
I was going to say that, at least the Jewish Latin American immigrants, right, that their trajectory has been one of very fast integration, at least the cases that I know. Their children, if they're born in Israel, Hebrew is their first language, and they speak bad Spanish, if at all. Sometimes not even the first generation. If they have come before the age of 10 or whatever, again, Hebrew becomes the language that they're more used to. The ones who have grown and married seem to marry anyone, doesn't seem to marry that levels of exogamy are very low. Segregation is almost non-existent. They're all over the place. So it seems that this is a group that in 2 generations or 3 may disappear. Actually, they may have some memory of origin, but not particular behaviors or profiles.
Yeah, you do have a continuing stream of immigrants. The numbers are small, unless there's a crisis, a political crisis or economic crisis. I mentioned the 2001 crisis. So in 2002, you had 6,000 Argentines coming to Israel. You can't imagine how many emails I received from Jewish Argentine families asking me about the possibility of their kids entering Tel Aviv University following the electoral victory of Peronism in Argentina in this past December. So there's a kind of a panic among many Jewish Argentine families.
Yeah, but that's like Americans when Republicans win, that they all are going to go to Canada and very few go. So.
Yeah, not very many go, but changing political and economic circumstances do influence in the decision of individuals whether to relocate to Israel or not. So since there's a continuing stream of immigrants, and since everyone in this identity politics of Israel wants to perform with an added value of yet another identity component, not just being Israeli, but also of one origin or another, it's not going to disappear in the next few years, that's for sure. Because nowadays, you know, everybody needs to have either an additional passport, not just the Israeli passport, or at least an additional identity component. So my wife, my wife's family relocated to Israel in 1963, so my wife was 3 years old. I hope she doesn't matter that I reveal her age here. But still at home they spoke Spanish and only Spanish. In the private sphere. Outside of home they spoke Hebrew only. And our kids who were born in Israel have their Argentine citizenship, and they care about Argentina, although they don't go there very often, although, but they are proud of their Argentine passport, yes, undoubtedly.
I have one more. Can you give us a sense of what your source for the Jewish population in the major Latin American countries is today? I mean, we hear all numbers. I grew up there. I remember the numbers that were at that time 500,000 in the 60s, and then now the numbers to 50. What is your source for what you think are the populations, if you can, of some of the few countries?
Yeah, you know, Jewish organizations everywhere are obsessed with the question of numbers. How many Jews live here? How many Jews live there? Etc. And obviously, the question is how does one count? Do you count only those who are halakhically Jewish? I wasn't trained as a Jewish historian. I was trained as a Latin Americanist. So as far as I'm concerned, every individual who has a Jewish identity component, I consider him or her as Jewish. So I tend to think in, let's say, larger numbers than the figures offered by, I don't know, the Jewish Agency or the World Jewish Congress or the whatever Jewish organization. We do have demographers. In the Hebrew U, we have a demographer by the name of Sergio de la Pergola. So he has his own estimates, which I do often use, but I tend to believe that the numbers are larger than what he offers. Most sources nowadays would talk about something like 200,000 Jews in Argentina. Is that correct, Danny? More or less? Yeah. I guess that the numbers are larger, and I'm amazed by the presence of Jewish themes and topics in Argentine media, in the urban life of Buenos Aires. I guess that outside of Israel and outside of New York, there's probably no other city in the world where the Jewish presence is felt so noticeably like Buenos Aires. Like in Buenos Aires.
In Tel Aviv, a little.
No, outside of Israel, I mean. Yeah, and outside of... Yeah.
Again, I'm not a professional. I didn't research the Argentinian Jewry. I just come from there. I left Argentina almost 50 years ago and returned only once. But one of the things that strike me most is the fact that I knew a very extremely secular Jewish community in Buenos Aires. In the Jewish community in Buenos Aires back in the 60s, when I grew up there, there was not even one. There were 0 kosher restaurants in Buenos Aires, with hundreds of thousands of Jews residing there. Today, the Jewish community has shrinked and became much more religious. Even in the Bombonera, in the Boca Juniors Stadium, there is a kosher hamburger
right?
and hot dog stand, which is unconscionable back in those days. As far as I know, the first kosher McDonald's outside Israel was in Buenos Aires. And you see the most extreme religious rabbis from Israel, Toldot Aharon and sects that are really the most extreme ultra-Orthodox rabbis come to Buenos Aires, and they have adherents there. That is something that for me, and finally in the AMIA, the Jewish community of Buenos Aires, in the elections, the list that won is Agudat Israel, which is an ultra-Orthodox list. Something that, again, I don't remember, I barely remember seeing a Jew with a yarmulke in Buenos Aires in my days.
Dramatically. That's absolutely true. But, you know, I often mentioned an Argentine telenovela called Los Graduados, which was hugely popular about 10 years ago or something like that. And this telenovela portrays the life of two supposedly prototypical porteño families. So one is obviously of Italian origin, and the other is obviously of Jewish origins. Now, it was hugely successful, as I said, so the Chilean television purchased the rights to produce their own version. And their version portrays the life of two prototypical families of Santiago de Chile. One is obviously of Spanish origins, and the other is obviously of Palestinian origins. So the fact that this telenovela, but many other cultural productions of all sorts, take a Jewish family as a prototype for a porteño family says something about the presence and visibility of things having to do with Jews in contemporary Argentina.
Yes, I have a question. Here in the United States, many young people become lone soldiers in Israel. Are there any from South America going?
Yes, definitely.
Lone soldiers?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, but there are definitely lone soldiers from Argentina, Brazil, and a couple of other countries in Israel. Yes, I know a few cases, but I have no clue about numbers.
Just want to add something that this gentleman said, that there are now kosher restaurants. I come from Uruguay. There are also now kosher restaurants, and this is the influence of Chabad. Chabad is very active all over Latin America.
Yeah, that's correct. Not just Chabad, but Chabad is very present in South America. Right.
Okay, I think we have exploited you enough.
I enjoyed it.
Pleasure as always. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.